Al-Qadisi in his history mentioned that the Sheikh, he would stand in the night for worship and then fast in the daytime. And he had many different righteous things that he did. He would visit the pious people when the night came. And he would spend the night moving around and being in good company with people. And he was never absent from the dhikr of Allah. And every day and night, he would either be doing a Khatam of the Quran or reciting what will become a Khatam. His level of making Khatams of Quran was such that some people said, no, it's far-fetched. There's no way he could be doing Khatams with all the writing he's doing. It seemed far-fetched. This is far-fetched. It's not possible. No, he was doing it. He was doing it. Right. So this was his level of knowledge. Because of his rank and knowledge, there were gatherings of people that would come and learn from him, from the scholars of the school of Imam Ahmed and their imams, such as the Maqdisis, the Ulfis, and the Imam Ibn Jawzi rahimahullah, as said by Ibn Rajab, sometimes he inclined towards ta'wil in some of his speech. And because of that, they would firmly make rebuke against him. There's no doubt. Now Imam Ibn Rajab rahimahullah says, وَلَا رَيْبَ أَنَّ كَلَامَهُ فِي ذَلِكَ مُضْطَرَبْ مُخْتَلِفٌ. There's no doubt that his speech on that topic was very complex and differed and was contradictory. And وهو وإن كان مطلعا على الأحاديث والآثار في هذا الباب فلم يكن خبيرا بحل شبهة المتكلمين ومن فسادها. And it should be known that even if you look at the ahadith and narratives in that on that subject, then there's no way that someone could lift the doubts of the speculative theologians in this regard. But he did, and he made clear their corruption. Imam Jawzi وكان معظما لأبي الوفاء ibn Aqil. He had a tremendous amount of respect for Ibn Aqil. يتابعه في أكثر ما يجري في كلامه. And he followed most of what he found in Ibn Aqil's works. وإن كان قد ورد عليه في بعض المسائل, even if he only found some of what was in his Masail. وكان ابن عقيل بارعا في الكلام. And Ibn Aqil was known for his deep delving into kalam. This is in his early era. So Imam Jawzi rahimahullah, he looked at these things, took some of the Masail, examined it, and followed him in his research methodology, but not his kalam. ولم يكن تام الخبر بالحديث والآثار ولهذا يضطرب في هذا الباب وتتلون فيه آراءه وأبو-Faraj تبعه له في هذا التلون. And so Ibn Aqil did not have full examination of the hadith and athar when he was engaged in kalam, because it's the early part of his career. And it's because of this he was confused in that area. And so it's because that تتلون فيه آراء. And that's why his rulings and his understandings took on that level of confusion. And Ibn Al Jawzi followed him in that same regard, even though he was higher in rank in that regard, right? So, so this is what happened. But Ibn Al Jawzi, rahimahullah, his level of knowledge was of a high standard. And the high standard of his knowledge is acknowledged by scholars of his time and those after him. And everyone acknowledges that his grandeur was of a high caliber.
The Imam, he was a Shaykh al-Islam.
Yes.
So this meant that he was an expert, he had mastery in all of the Ulum al-Shari'iyah.
Yes, this is correct. His rank was well known, and the strength of his memorization was well known. He was considered an equal by the highest ranking imams in his time.
Now, he has the title Hafiz al-Hadith. Does this mean he had at least memorized 100,000 hadith?
That's usually what's used for hadith memorizers, but you have to understand at that time, Imam Al Jawzi rahimahullah had his own chain of transmission and his own methodology, so he knew more than this.
Right,
because he's also the sheikh. He's one of the sheikhs of Abdul-Ghani ibn Abdul Wahid al-Maqdisi, who had 700,000. So he's somewhere around the area of Imam Abdul Ghani ibn Abdul Wahid al-Maqdisi. Now the Imam, as a point, when he dies in the year 597 of the Hijri, when he dies, a huge outcry happens because all of the people are devastated at the loss of this great Imam. Now, before he died, he set out and traveled to Mosul and other areas just to teach, just to guide people, even though he was old. And he didn't need to do this. But he set out and traveled to Mosul and decided he was going to teach people and make his way. He would do that. He would teach them poetry. He would listen to people, read hymn books. And he was just all around very actively involved. Up till the day that he died, he was actively involved in activities that had things to do with this religion. Now, what was your question?
I just had one question on the hadith issue. Was Imam Ibn Al Jawzi strict in his hadith grading?
Okay. When thinking about Imam Al Jawzi rahimahullah, his writing style in hadith is, you have to look at when muhaddithun, or people of ahadith, when they write books, how they ascertain texts. Imam Ibn Jawzi rahimahullah, when he examined ahadith, he had his own methodology for grading ahadith. And so when you look at his book, Al-Mawdu'at, not everything that's cited in there is mawdu' in the most general sense of the word. There's actually some tashaddud, or some stringency in his methodology, because he had his own methodology for grading ahadith and what he considered reliable. So that and his other kitab, Al-Du'afa wal-Matrukeen, that one about weak ahadith and matrukeen, right? That hadith kitab was also known for its stringency, because Imam Jawzi rahimahullah, you have to remember, he's writing books in these fields because he's a master in this field. So he's writing books in this field. So he's not a student. He's a master in this field. And so he carves out his own patch. Well, other masters also have to go through and sift through those books and say, okay, listen, this area is too stringent. This area is this, right? They go through and they check into these things. But he added a great deal to the area of hadith. He is the first one in his book, Al-Kashf fi Ahadith Sahihain. He's the first one that I know to my memory to have brought together Bukhari and Muslim and examined them in terms of the fiqh al-hadith that can be taken from them in the fashion that we study them today. Now, I can't say for sure, but it looks to be that that was some of the road work that was used by Imam Ibn Rajab al-Hanbali when he wrote his Fath al-Bari. And then he didn't finish his Fath al-Bari, but Imam Ibn Hajar built on top of the Fath al-Bari of Ibn Rajab and finished it and built on top of it. So it looks to be the case that Imam Jawzi rahimahullah was one of the source texts for the work that was done, which also makes sense because Ibn Jawzi rahimahullah has another book called Al-Tahqiq fi Ahadith al-Khilaf, which is an examination of the ahadith on the difference of opinion of the fiqh rulings among the different madhhabs on how they're applied, why those differences of opinion occur, why the madhhabs differ in them, and then he'll give the position that he believes the strength of the the Ahadith's application according to the Hanbali madhhab,
Oh.
right? But he cites everyone else and their evidences as well, and also gives the narratives, and he also does the jarh and ta'dil on the narrators, right?
Mhm.
Then he has Akhbaru Ahl Rasukh, which is a book about ahadith that are abrogated, that abrogate other ones. Famous ahadith that people might not know are abrogated or abrogate other ahadith, which is also important. And it's strange because some of the same thing is those people that will use ahadith and think that, oh yes, it's still in effect when it's abrogated, like the hadith where the Rasulullah said when he was asked about a man touching his private parts, he said, that's just a piece of meat from you. And people think, oh yeah, that means it doesn't abrogate at all. It doesn't nullify wudu at all, ever. But Imam Jawzi rahimahullah said, no, there's another hadith that was cited by Abu Hurairah. And Abu Hurairah, he became Muslim late in Al-Madinah, which means that's the last statement on that topic, which means it must be abrogating this other one that was said in Mecca, which he says, if any one of you stretches out his hand to touch his genitals when there's no barrier between his hand and the genitals, let him make wudu. So that's a clear indicator, right, that it abrogates and of the hukm, right? So these types of things are important to understand in terms of their application.
And if I may ask this, all of his 1,000 books, are they all extant today?
They are extant, but some of them are printed while others are in manuscript form. Right? There's one that he has. So his Ar-Radd al-Muta'assib, which is the rebuke of the one who shows love towards Yazid.
Wow.
Because there were people who had a strange, bizarre thing towards Yazid, and he attacked them. And then he also wrote a book in answer to the Twelvers that were calling him Nasibi and all these other strange things. He answered them with another kitab. He had this kitab, but there's another one which was something that he saw coming, because he quoted a hadith about a time will come in which there will be men that delve deeply into the religion and into the fiqh. And then they say, if only we could come close to the rulers and benefit from their earthly life, but stay separate with our religion. But that shall not be the case, just as nothing is harvested from the thorny bush but thorns. Imam Jawzi rahimahullah said this is an example of what shall happen closer to the end of time with government scholars, and what we've seen examples from. Because by Ibn Al Jawzi's time, he'd seen examples of government scholars, but not to the same degree as it will become later, where these people actually make their bread and butter off of being employees of the government, like civil servants, like in Egypt or Tunisia or other places like this. Government scholars are a reality because they eat, breathe, and sleep off of the government. They're like civil servants, right?
And how did the Imam actually gain his income? What did he used to do?
He was a coppersmith.
Mashallah.
Yeah, he was a coppersmith, and also he was a coppersmith. And usually, when you're a coppersmith, you were also a tanner, which means that you tan hides. So because the books at that point were written on vellum, which is gazelle skin or camel skin or sheepskin, right? So you would make your money by selling tanned hide, and then any income that he got from books. So what you had is you had bookstores, like how you would have Barnes and Noble or other things like that. And he would set a price on the books to pay for the ink, to pay for the hide, to pay for other things. So he was a coppersmith. He also was a tanner, and he also sold books, because he wrote books on many different topics. So at the bookstore, there'd be a sign up saying new book coming, right? Ibn Al Jawzi coming soon. Oh, subhanallah. And so that book would be on display in the bookstore in Baghdad. If you wanted to purchase that book, a warraq, which was a copier, would take a copy of that book and would write out a copy of it from the original that's displayed in the store. And he would say, come back in a week and it'll be ready. or however many people ordered it. And that's what you do. So pre-orders was where the waraq was approached ahead of time and said, we'd like to take some pre-orders. And so it was a nice little economy because Imam Jawzi, rahimahullah, he got paid, the writers got paid, right? The bookstore got paid for hosting the books.
Yes.
If they had him come into the bookstore and give a reading, that gave a nice little income to the bookstore. And it's all halal. This is the great thing about it.
And the interesting thing is that if, let's say, 100 people want a book, they'll need a lot of time, and they need also then extra people to copy these books.
This is correct. So you need extra people to copy the books. And what happens is as they're writing them, they're also speaking them in order to reduce the possibility of error.
Subhanallah.
Right. So that's also another thing. That's where you'll notice that there's people just like when people read the Quran and they're following it with their finger and they're uttering it silently with their tongues, it helps reduce errors. So when you're writing out a book by hand and you're speaking it, it helps reduce errors as well. And so you'll find it's a humorous thing, and it's something that my teacher would always kind of snarl. One of my teachers would snarl about. So he'd say it's so strange because the written copies we have of mutun are better than the print copies sometimes. So something will be produced on like a typewriter or a computer. Look at these mistakes.
Right.
And they'll say, but look at the makhtuta, like look at the manuscript, look at that. Right. And then look at the print copy. He's like, look at this. He said, this is crazy. He said, this shouldn't be happening. He said, these people say that they're so technologically advanced, but they can't do a simple thing like printing out a method.
Right.
Because you have to remember that the people also that were writing them out, they had an investment in it because of the love of the knowledge and the love of the man that wrote it. Whereas some of the people now that are writing these out, they don't have that. They're looking at it as, got to get this out. Wonder how much money this will get. We have to pay for the advance that we gave the author. Oh, we better get it on the shelf. See, the intent and the desires behind it are different.
Yes.
And so it produces a different urgency.
And the skill levels are day and night different because someone writing and typing, this is so different because the computer has already prepared a lot for you already.
It has. And if you look at people when they write out things, you know, we again, when we used to memorize things, a portion of our memorization would be writing it out. So once you'd uttered it from memory, then you had to write it out and present it to the teacher to show that you could reproduce it like how it looks in the book, which really meant that you knew it. So when you did that, it's like, oh, subhanallah, you really know it. It's like, yeah, I wrote it out, right? So then it's stable in your head, you know, because you definitely wrote it, right? And it definitely came to pass. And that's the proof of the knowledge.
Yes.
Versus if you typed it on a typewriter, but you never look at these mutun and you never go through them. Well, it's just something, I got to get this done. So whether it's best thought or best thought to you, it doesn't matter. Whether it's musaytir or musaytir to you, it doesn't matter, right? Because you're just trying to get it typed out. We got to get this on the shelves. Yes. It's got to be done for tomorrow, right?
Exactly.
It's just a rush. Versus we're going to take our time to write this out, to get out, because writing and calligraphy and penmanship, there's an elegance that goes with it.
Yes. And
sometimes you can tell by certain transmitters, you can tell by their calligraphy. I know who that is. Right? Whether they're writing out a mushaf, sometimes in manuscripts, like there's a manuscript of Rob al-Murbi', who the main student that recited it to Imam Al-Bahuti rahimahullah, you can tell his handwriting because he'll put Al-Hajawi's words in red and Al-Bahuti's in black. But his handwriting is also really like, it's so easy to read. Like you can read the manuscript. It's not smudged. Because during this time, great emphasis was put on handwriting. It's still said today. It was still said today when someone has good handwriting, you know, Hasn al-Khat, he has good handwriting. Right? That's a compliment that you write well. You know, that's a sign of scholarship that your handwriting is good. If it's bad, that's a sign of like ummiyah, like a sign of illiteracy.
I just had 2 more questions on the books. If someone gains an income from these books, can one use the income in his personal life? Is it like restricted in any way because it's a book of ulum sharia?
Someone, if they have the right intention, if they're making intention by selling books of the revealed law, if the things that the books are printed on are from permissible materials, he's obtained them in a permissible way, and he's accurately reproducing what the author did without intrusive notes negating the author, because some of these people will have these books where they'll have like these footnotes or like a separate chapter like attacking the author. This is haram or something like this. So it's like it becomes almost like their own shatter. It's like,
Yes.
Aren't you the printer?
Yes.
I thought you're just the printer or the editor. Why are you like inserting like 3 or 4 additional chapters, right? If anything, if you're going to do that, it should be buttressing what the author said. So if you're not doing those things, it's permitted. But you don't want to sell mushafs. You shouldn't be selling mushafs, right? Because the scholars say that mushafs aren't to be sold, right? But the kutub, if you're making the intent by selling the kutub for the dissemination of the knowledge and to also pay for the paper, the printer, and things like that, this is permitted. But you have to be careful to make sure that the intention is clean. So every day you have to make a clean intention, because what's happened if people get caught up and lost in the business of printing these books, then they'll forget the purpose behind why. And the why is to fortify people's knowledge. So the people that I tend to, it seems, some people might say it's extreme, but I'm even particular about the people that I buy my books from, like the printing houses and the organizations.
Right.
Not only because they don't corrupt books or whatever else, but also like who's behind it and why. What's their purpose between doing it? Because that's transmitted in the book as well. Like, what's their attention to detail? Like, and this is why Imam Salih Hishami, Hafidhullah, and his brother Abdur-Rahman, they're very particular about who they go with. So the books of Imam Salih Hishami are printed through one or two channels, because they're so particular, and they're printed on a certain type of paper, and that paper is excellent quality.
Wow.
It's excellent quality. And the khat as well as the tashkil, it's really good khat and tashkil. Very, very good. Because you're printing hadith works, and you have to give them their due respect and due diligence.
So I just had a few more questions on the life of the Imam before moving on. One of them is also, since we're also now talking about the books, how did actually the Imam's books get to us, the books he authored? Meaning through what way, the chains and so forth.
Okay. Alhamdulillah. When we talk about the Imam's legacy and how it reached us, one was through the warraqun, or the warraq, the transmitters who write these books that put them in the bookstores and places like this. Others are through his students, which include his son, his grandson, Muwafiquddin al-Qudama, who studied hadith with him, in addition to other, and because they exchanged knowledge, because they were classmates of Shaikh Abu Al-Jilani, and they also exchanged knowledge with one another. Right? And there's some dispute among scholars about who was the more well-versed in hadith. Was it Ibn Al Jawzi or Muwafiquddin al-Qudama? Although they both learned from one another, right? But most scholars would say that Imam Al Jawzi rahimahullah kind of edged him in hadith, and then Muwafiquddin al-Qudama kind of edged him in fiqh.
Wow.
And you can see that. You can see that because Muwafiquddin al-Qudama, his fame and his rank is known primarily through fiqh.
Yeah.
Right. Ibn Al Jawzi's fame is known through hadith. Although he wrote a fiqh work, most students of knowledge, if you ask, yeah, what was the fiqh book that Imam Ibn Al Jawzi rahimahullah wrote, they'd have to really think about it, or they'd have to go, unless they were from the madhhab, they'd be, oh man, I'm sure he wrote one. I'm sure that he did, didn't he? So yeah, he did. It's like, I can't remember, right? Because it's a sound book, but it's just not what he was most famed for. Same thing with Muwafiq ibn Qudam rahimahullah. If you said, okay, what's a hadith work that you wrote, you'd have to sit down and think, like really, really think. Like, I'm sure there's one. There is. He did write something in hadith, like, what, you'd have to sit down and think.
Interesting.
Right? So I think in that way, they complemented each other, right? They complemented each other in a very unique fashion. Right?
There's also something interesting. I read this a long time ago, and I believe this is in Usayd al-Khatir, that the Imam himself said in his youth, when he was studying, that he read 20,000 books. Have you come across this?
Yes. There's a statement where he stated that he's read 20,000 books. There's another statement where he said that he would also write 20 pages every day.
Allah.
Right, of notes and things like this, to work gathering books, right? And so he would write every day, he'd gather things together. And so his writing style is he would deal with a subject, and he would write several books on that subject, which is really the Hanbali amal in terms of writing books, is they'll write several things. So if they write on like theology, they'll write 2-3 books in that area. If they write in fiqh, there'll be like several. Like if you look at Imam Ibn Qudama rahimahullah, it's like he's written like 6 books on fiqh to deal with that topic, right? The lineage of the companions and the Quraysh, he's got like 2 books on that topic, right? I'tiqad, right? Just on the topic of the Quran being the speech of Allah, he's got 3 books on that. Right, the Ulum of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he's got like 1 thick book and like another book on that. Right, then there's the Lum'ah, right? Then there's another one on the Quran being the speech called Al-Harf al-Qadim. He's got that one. Right, so there's like several books that he's written, and Imam Jawzi rahimahullah belongs to that same maslak of like writing books in a series. And so he deals. And if you look in his tafsir, you find him making utterances about astronomy, right? Or in history, in his history book, there'll be times in history where he makes reference to rock formations, or astronomical data, or historical information. Like Al-Muntazam, that kitab in history, you can tell that Ibn Kathir in his Al-Bidayah wa Nihayah, he lifted like huge amounts from that.
Yeah,
and then you have Ibn al-Imad, who wrote Shadarat al-Dhahab. He lifted from there, right? That book is like, Al-Muntazam is like the father of many history books, especially the methodology that Imam Jawzi rahimahullah took for writing history books. Like that methodology that he employed is pretty much the standard. He's got a book on Sirah that he used the same methodology, Al-Wafat. He's used the same methodology in a book on Sirah. Right? Even the Mawlid, he wrote a poetic meter on the Mawlid, but it's laid out almost historically, like it's laid out in chronological order. So his methodology, like they do things like in a series. A meslek is like a series of things, right? And it's in the first volume of a Muntazam that you find him discussing the topic of the size of the earth, not just its shape, but its size, and how much the size is. Because it was Imam Jawzi rahimahullah, it was his position, based upon having spoken with people that had started doing circumnavigation of the globe, and his findings from astronomy, because he had an observatory at the back of his house and other things. It was his position that the earth was larger than it was. So he was, I think it was like a point off or something like that. but the weight of the earth, he calculated using shadows and other things. He calculated the weight of the earth, its size. He'd been able to establish the sun's size as well. Remarkable. Versus the earth. Like he'd said in his tafsir, under the tafsir of Surah Yunus, like anyone that believes based upon our physical observation of the sun that the sun is smaller than the earth is obviously a fool. Like that was his statement. If you believe, you're a fool. There's no way that the sun is smaller than the earth. And he gave a number of proofs to establish this point. Then he gave a quote from Abu Ja'far al-Munadi on that there'd been consensus established in Ahmed's time, because you got to remember this is during the great observatory building and hospital building era, that there'd been a consensus established of the ovular shape of the earth and of the other heavenly bodies. And he cites this, I think it's like the 30th page into Al-Muntazam, where he cites that as a proof. And then he starts going into the size of the earth, its shape. He starts talking about the poles. He divides the world into degrees, longitude and latitudinal lines, and starts to discuss that, right? The different hemispheres. He discusses how many continents there are, the distribution of people. This is all stuff that he laid the groundwork for. Things that we take for granted today, he laid a lot of the groundwork for. And he took several sciences. And what was a history book? He took several different fields of research and put them all under one cover. And for that, I put him head and shoulders in that field over almost any other historian in any other language I can think of. Because of what he accomplished, the amount of time that he accomplished, and how he utilized his time in accomplishing those goals, which was second to none, what he accomplished.
I believe it is important to mention these things because today a lot of people, they think that our scholars and authorities, whether it's today or in the past, were merely learned in the science of the revealed law alone. And they do not know, or they follow this Orientalist mindset that they did not know any branch science, yani the Funun. But
people have to understand that the more you know of the revealed law, the more you start to know about other stuff outside of it.
Yeah.
Because you ultimately wind up having to go on different studies. Like my diving into geology came from, it was a runoff of additional information on the back of the revealed law.
MashaAllah.
And additional information that comes from that. You can't escape these types of things. And it has to do with also how we delve into knowledge, because our funun came out of our usul.
Right.
Because there was a purpose behind it. So we needed to try to make the inheritance law as simple as we could for people to master it, to be able to discharge their rights. So al-Jabr was brought about, and al-Qalat was brought about to try to simplify this process, right? Well, then as that ilm becomes more diversified, it becomes a fen by itself. So now it becomes hisab, mathematical calculation. It becomes a fen now, where originally it had become something to assist in the asl, it now becomes a fen. But you can't have the fen without the asl. But what happened with Western civilization is when their fen became diversified, they negated the usul, which is crazy. Because you've got to remember that the people that came up with geology or archaeology in the Western world were not scholars.
Yes.
Like the early pioneers of geology weren't scholars of rock formations or anything, but our early pioneers that looked at rock formation, they were. So the scholars were making a lot of the people that circumnavigated the globe were scholars in many different disciplines. That's not the case for the crafters of what would later become Western civilization as we know it today. Christopher Columbus wasn't a scholar of any sense, nor was he a geologist, nor was he an archaeologist, he wasn't those things.
Because we do not consider merely graduating from university as being an alim or scholar.
No, and especially it's not respected. Even today, I don't have respect for it if you've not been in the field either.
Mm-hmm.
Because this is another thing. There's people that come to conclusions on things and they've never been in the field, so they make factual errors. Like for example, there's things Richard Dawkins has said about geology that are factual errors. Now, as someone that's been in the field, that's physically been in the field,
right,
and looked at fossils and everything else, I know, listening to him, it's a factual error. Now, he's been pulled up by scholars greater than him, such as Eugenia Scott, that he makes factual errors. Because you have to remember, Dawkins is a man that deals in hypotheticals. He doesn't go out to archaeological digs or geology finds or looking at fossils. That's not what he does. He's either dealing with books or laboratories or other scholars. Now, that's a huge blindside.
And the fact that it's basically just being an expert in one fen only.
Yeah, and this is the situation. Now, he uses that to negate usul, which is weird because that's not the point. The Funun have come out of it, but how they reach the points where they reached is different.
Yes.
Like for example, if you look at an example of, okay, I'll give a crude example, but it still fits. When you separate the Muslim world from its usul and what produced it, you have the huge levels of illiteracy and the violence and everything that you have today.
Yeah.
That's what's happened. That's why Turkey looks like how it looks. That's why these other places, they look like that because you separated them from what they had before. Okay. If you separate the people in what we're calling Europe, the European Peninsula, which is still in Asia, but for the sake of this recording, we'll just say that Europe is a separate continent. Part of this is it's the seventh continent. So when you separate them from the Catholic Church, the Latin Rite, literacy goes up, math goes up, all these other things go, because all these other things, you have to remember the basis of what they viewed as knowledge. In the book of Genesis, whether it's in Latin or it's in English or Greek, it reads that when they ate from the book, when they ate from the tree of knowledge, their eyes open and they realized they were naked, and now they have knowledge of good and evil. The passage goes on to say, let us prevent them from eating from the tree of the other tree so that they might become gods like us. So from the very beginning, the Catholic Church had a deep suspicion about acquiring too much knowledge or about acquiring knowledge. So now you understand their attitude towards acquiring knowledge.
Right.
It was this deep suspicion about acquiring knowledge and a deep suspicion of the world around. So they were very suspicious of people doing a lot of circumnavigation and everything else. It led to fallouts with Galileo. Now, I wanted to just correct a notion. A lot of people have this notion that the Catholic Church had said that the earth was flat and everything. This is not true. Okay. That's not the position of the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church never said that. In fact, they quote in the book of Isaiah that and the Lord's throne sits over the circle of the earth. Okay. They never said that the earth was flat. Their situation is when Galileo Galilei made the statement that rather, because the Catholic Church had taught that man is the centerpiece of creation, and earth sits in the middle of the universe and everything is around it. It's the important part. Galileo Galilei said, no, the sun rests in the middle and the earth goes around it. So the sun is the centerpiece that everything depends on. It's a heliocentric universe rather than an earth-centered universe. That's where they got after it. Okay. Their dispute had nothing to do with flatness. Right. Okay. Had to do with the centrality of man. Is man the centerpiece of creation, the most important part of creation, or not? By saying that the sun is in the center of our solar system or our universe, says that man is not the centerpiece.
So isn't this more theological than scientific?
It is. It is. Whereas for the Muslim, that's got nothing to do with the situation, because we would read in the Quran where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, and we created things in the sky and the earth greater than you. Mm-hmm. So we wouldn't say that man is the centerpiece.
Subhanallah.
So whether the earth is in the center of the galaxy of the sun is irrelevant to us.
Subhanallah.
Because it doesn't really affect us either. Because if you're on the sun, if you could go on to the sun and the sun had a hard surface to be on and you could survive and look at the earth from the sun, it would look like the earth was going around it.
Right.
And then on earth, it looks like the sun is going around it. So it becomes a relative issue. It's not really a concern for us.
Exactly.
Right. So these types of issues are when we have to understand the fallout of how learning is viewed in the Western world, what we're calling the Western world, the European Peninsula, how that is viewed versus how learning is viewed in Darul Islam is different.
Yes.
Because how we acquired learning and knowledge is different, and what the purpose was for. For them, they looked at acquiring too much learning caused the fall of the human race. Oh. For us, a lack of knowledge leads to your destruction. Because Allah said in Surah Muhammad, the 47th Surah 19, "Fa'alam annahu la ilaha illallah." You should know there is no God but Allah. So we have a strong attachment to the necessity of learning stuff. Particularly, firstly, knowledge of the revealed law, and then second of all, understand the world around you. Because you need to know enough to know where the Qibla is.
Right.
You need to know the North Star to know where the Qibla is. You need to know that the wind in general travels due east in order to know where the Qibla is. You need to know all these types of things, what country you're in. If you're in Egypt, what direction the Qibla is. If you're in Russia, what direction the Qibla. You need to know these things. So knowing about the world around you is absolutely crucial.
But according to the West, why would it basically be damaging if one would obtain scientific knowledge, Funun, them?
Because at the time that the Catholic Church was there, a lot of these things were viewed, the Latin rite of the Catholic Church. The Latin rite of the Catholic Church viewed a lot of these things with great suspicion, because it was assumed that it would actually be used as a ploy by the shaitan to take man away from the centrality of man's purpose on earth, Christ's blood poured out at Calvary on the cross for man's ultimate salvation. Because when you start saying that man is not the center, that earth is not the center, and that man is not the crowning creation, well, then what was the purpose of Christ's coming to be sacrificed on the cross to die for all of humanity? So, like, that is the wellspring of where Christianity comes from. If that's not true, then Christianity's been done away with, right? Then you have to also remember, when people start finding out that the earth is older than 6,000 years, that also starts a big mess, because the Jews, you have to remember, their calendar is 58, 53 right now. So the Jews believe the earth is 5,853 years old from the point of creation. Orthodox Jews. Reform and conservative, not so much.
So both the Jews and the Christians agree on this thing?
The Orthodox Christians.
Orthodox ones, all right.
Yeah. Now, as of late, the Protestant Christians from, say, the last 150 years have modified their view.
Right.
But 500 years ago, when there were no Protestants, at that point, their position was that the earth is 6,000 years old. Creation 6,000 years old. And when you reach the 7,000 year mark, that's the end of everything.
All right. So
So when you start saying that these rocks were made over hundreds of thousands of years, now you start problems.
Right.
But it's not just that, because you say, well, we can negate that. But then you make it to Egypt and you uncover the pyramids, and you go inside the king's list at Abydos, and you find that Ramses II, he's reciting his whole family line. Everything seems fine the first 4,000 years, then 5,000 years, then 6,000 years, 7,000 years. Now it's a lineage going back 9,000 years. Which, now you can't have 9,000 years, they'd be in space. How are they reciting all this? Right? So it has to do with their understanding of knowledge. Now for Muslims, to us, it doesn't matter one way or another, because again, we said that we came down here from the paradise, and everything had already, a lot of things had already passed. We've been told by the Rasulullah that most of human history is already passed. So by the time we come out into the world, we're expecting to find an extremely ancient and old planet.
Right.
We're expecting to find it.
As the jinns have lived here before us.
Yes. So we're expecting to find old monuments that are unexplainable because they're before our time, or maybe they weren't built by humans. We're expecting to find that. So when we do, we're like, yes, that's exactly what happened. Right? For the same thing for when trying to explain different races.
Right.
How did this happen? Well, for us, it's not an issue, because you go back to the Hadith in the Sahih Bukhari, it mentions the people of paradise, that their skin is translucent to the degree that you can see the marrow and the bones. So this would mean that Nabiyuna Adam alayhi salam was the same thing. And so melanin is a later thing. But for these guys, no, we need to find out. So then the pale people, some pale people started saying that everyone was pale, and having dark skin is a blemish. But now as of late, now you have people saying, no, dark skin is the best. And having any other skin color, especially pale skin, is a blemish. Well, maybe for living on Earth at this time. But we can't say that we know for a fact what Earth's conditions were like at all times, because when we go back in history, we find tree trunks 50 feet around. So obviously we can tell that the planet has been undergoing some changes. We can't say for sure about Nabiyuna Adam alayhi salam regarding his skin color, because as it said about the people of the paradise, that they don't have a sclera, which means their eye is, not white, doesn't have a white portion of the eye, and that the skin is translucent. Well, if Nabiyuna Adam and Hawa alayhim salam were both from there, that means that's what they were. So when they come down here, that's what they were. Now, later on, they obviously would have, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would have had to have done something to them to make it so that they can function down here.
Right.
But yeah, but it says he was made from black clay. Okay, yeah. Have you ever worked in a clay pottery shop? When you bake something black or gray in the oven, it turns what? Sandy brown. So even that argument is foolishness. And if you think that there's a literal clay oven and literal clay and people are jumping out of that oven and becoming human beings, you're an idiot. Again, because we're back at tafweed again, unfortunately, for some people. These are real events that happened. But the reality of how it looked and what it looks like, we don't know. But we have the events. And it's so strange that the people that call themselves people of Ta'wil would insist that this is literal. I thought you're the people of Ta'wil.
Right.
You don't do Ta'wil on this. This is literal. There's literal black clay, a literal black guy, a literal black. This is literal. But it's Ta'wil on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sifat. Fine.
Right.
But that's something for a later day. But
Yeah,
the point in fact is, this is our attitude towards knowledge. So that's why you have scholars like Imam Ibn Al Jawzi, to bring it full circle. They have this huge writing output. Whereas during this same period in the European peninsula, there's not this big writing glut.
Indeed.
The big writing glut, the big writing output is now at the Renaissance and times where there's this attempt to pull away from religion.
Yes.
Because it's seen as something that's preventing people's advancement.
SubhanAllah.
So you have the Enlightenment, the Age of Reason, all these other things are happening. And so they assume that by being able to become literate, having indoor plumbing, and reducing deaths because of typhus and tetanus, that that's somehow some big knock on all religion. But that's not true. Mm-hmm. It's your perception of how knowledge and learning was that put you in that condition. It's not all religion. And it's not anything to do with that. So when you speak with people from the European Peninsula or people that have the European Peninsula mindset, that's the first thing. Oh, all religions ever done is cause wars. What are you talking about? Mm-hmm. We just had 2 monster civil wars in Europe that had nothing to do with religion, mm-hmm. in which 37 million were killed in one and 55 million were killed in another. There was nothing at all to do with any religion. Mm-hmm. What about the 37 million or more that Stalin killed? That wasn't religion.
Sure.
Or Pol Pot, that wasn't religion either. What about the Tutsis and the Hutus? That wasn't religion either.
Mao Zedong.
Mao Zedong is another. That wasn't religion mm-hmm. either. So religion's got nothing to do with having a propensity mm-hmm. of being a homicidal maniac.
Yeah.
Being a homicidal maniac or a megalomaniac is something to do with the human condition. Now, there are times where people might use religion. So you have Ayman al-Zawahiri, because he's coming from a Muslim background, uses it. That's true. Mm-hmm. But Ayman al-Zawahiri using that to get the funding for the 4 planes that rammed into some buildings is not that far off from Pol Pot, mm-hmm. who used the same thing, but this time it was secularism to kill as many of his own people that he killed. Mm-hmm. So it's understanding that one thing's doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the other.